So my name is Dean Peacock. I work with Sonke Gender Justice Network in South Africa.
What social movements are you part of, and how would you define your activism?
Yeah, it's an interesting question as to what constitutes a social movement. I'm not sure in South Africa we have very many social movements in place at the moment that have the strength and the kind of coherence to warrant the name. So I would make a bit of a distinction between what constitutes a social movement and what constitutes an NGO sector. I think we're very much part of an NGO sector, and in some ways we're part of a more activist NGO constituency made up by organizations like ourselves, Section 27, the Treatment Action Campaign. And I think what makes us a little bit more activist in our orientation is that we make quite a lot of demands on the state in terms of the state fulfilling their responsibilities and in fact their obligations.
Would you say that you are part of the women's movement, gender justice movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say we're part of both. So in South Africa there's a rather kind of disorganized gender justice sector. It's not very strong. And we, Sonke Gender Justice, has become one of the strongest organizations doing gender equality work in South Africa. And because we're an organization that uses the strategy of engaging men and boys, we're regarded still with some ambivalence by some of our women's rights partners. And so I wouldn't say we easily fall into the women's rights movement in South Africa. I would also say that there isn't a women's rights movement in South Africa. There are a few rather weak women's rights organizations. So we're definitely part of a gender justice movement though, and I would say more broadly part of a health and social justice movement.
What are you trying to change in your work in activism?
Lots of things. So I think we're trying to change. Yeah, we're certainly trying to address gender inequalities. We're trying to prevent gender-based violence. And within that broad category of gender-based violence, we do work that addresses domestic and sexual violence perpetrated by men against women, and we do a lot of work on the issue of men's violence against men, particularly in the context of prisons. So South Africa has a large prison population under really dreadful circumstances. So we've got, rampant overcrowding, we've got very poor monitoring of prisons, and so sexual violence in prisons is just a massive, grotesque problem. So we're trying to do some work to address, sexual violence in prison, and then lots of work to strengthen a sense of citizen activism in South Africa so that we can address all of the issues: HIV, gender-based violence, human rights more broadly. What was the question again? What are we trying to do?
Yes.
Okay. So I would say I think we're trying to deepen democracy, we're trying to strengthen a human rights culture in South Africa, and we're trying to advance gender equality. And those things are all interconnected. So our work to advance gender equality is very deliberately also about trying to deepen democracy. So we do a lot of work to hold state actors to account, a lot of work to train and mobilize community members so that they can become part of the process of holding state actors to account.
Do you see the difference between working with young people and older people?
Definitely. I don't think we do enough work with young people. So our work, and not in very deliberate ways, has ended up being more focused on adults, in part because of the competencies we had in the organization. So our work really does focus on the kind of 20 and up crowd. We do some work with younger people, but not as much as we should. And I think it's a mistake. I think we know that one of the most effective things we could do to address violence would be to work with young people, particularly to challenge or to address trauma related to exposure to violence. And we're not doing that. We should.
What are the challenges and tensions between women's movements and other social movements?
I'll speak specifically about South Africa, a context I'm more familiar with. In South Africa, the women's movement, I think some of the kind of tension lines and the fault lines are in some ways around leadership. So the women's rights organizations are much too white in terms of the leadership, disproportionately white. There are very few prominent black leaders of women's rights organizations. And so I think other social movements have a little bit of a hard time engaging with them because it feels sometimes like kind of elite politics. I think one of the other tensions is that women's rights organizations in South Africa, in part because the magnitude of the problem of violence is so big, haven't been very intersectional in the way that they do their work. So there hasn't been I would say, by traditional women's rights organizations, hasn't been that much of a focus on HIV. And so it's not the attention per se, but it's a lack of attention. And, you know, we experience some tension from time to time with women's rights organizations because we've grown very quickly at a time when many women's rights organizations are struggling to access money. So that's created some tensions.
I see. What do you like to see happen to address these tensions and challenges?
I think I think civil society in South Africa continues to be disproportionately led by white people. That has to change. I think that in as much as we don't change that, we will always encounter resistance both at the community level and at the government level. And so I think we continue to hamstring ourselves by not paying sufficient attention to transformation in the management and leadership of organizations that do this kind of work. That needs to be addressed. And I think, in terms of our own relationship with women's rights organizations, we have to get better at figuring out how to work together on joint projects. And we have to get better at demanding that more money be made available. 12 years ago, it was unimaginable that billions of dollars would be made available for AIDS prevention work. It just was unimaginable. And within a very short period of time, the paradigm changed. We still exist in that unimaginable paradigm when it comes to resources for women's rights work. The UN Trust Fund is one of the biggest makers of grants, and they make grants that amount to $30 million. That's nothing. And so I think we really do need to think about how we expand the pie of existing resources and make demands that, the necessary billions be made available.
The last one. Do you know of any examples where movements have worked well together? What can we learn from those movements?
Where different social movements have worked well together. I'm not sure that I do know of very many. Certainly in some of the anti-war demonstrations in the build-up to the Gulf War, we saw, coalitions that included representatives from lots of different social movements. Those were successful as demonstrations. They didn't stop the war, and I don't think they've stayed together very well. So,
do you think Men Engage, for example, could be a good example, or can learn from other examples of those coalitions? And
I don't think Men Engage is an alliance of different movements. It's an alliance of very similar organizations. And so could Men Engage become a space that brings together the environmental movement, the movement to hold arms dealers to account, LGBTI movements? It could. But it feels like it's having a hard enough time keeping its member organizations together at the moment. I don't feel enormously optimistic in the short term about that happening.